Welcome to Profoundly Human. My guest today is Mark Miller. Mark, absolute pleasure to have you. Good to see you again. It's been so long, but welcome to the show.
It is great to see you, and thanks for this opportunity to talk to your folks.
You're very welcome. As you may know, I start off with some very difficult questions like, are you a coffee drinker?
Yes, I am, but it's kind of a frou-frou kind of coffee. I like a mocha, preferably from Starbucks. But if it's a venti, I only want 4 pumps of mocha because I'm cutting back, right? Instead of 5, I want to do 4 pumps.
And is this an everyday thing, or is this a once a week thing, or what is the ritual?
On a good day, it's multiple times a day.
Okay. And is there a time you have to stop drinking coffee, otherwise you won't be able to sleep at night?
I do usually flip to decaf after 6 o'clock.
Okay. All right. So you're going on the caffeine pretty strong every day.
Yes, sir.
What about, do you have a favorite movie?
And I love the original Matrix movie.
Okay, interesting. What do you love about it?
I don't know. I think it was, for me, it was a combination of great story and great cinematography. And in many ways, I don't know if it was technically groundbreaking, but it felt like groundbreaking cinematography with great story. And, I feel like a lot of the movies that I see, the story's okay or the cinematography's okay, but when you can put those together, I think it's quite magical.
Fantastic. What about, what is your favorite menu item at Chick-fil-A?
I love them all, of course, but my favorite would have to be the nuggets. I'm a nuggets guy.
You're a nuggets guy. All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. How long have you been working for Chick-fil-A now?
I have been on staff about 44 years. I worked a short period in the restaurant, one of the local restaurants before that. So closing in on 45 years total.
Okay, very good. And correct me if I'm wrong, but do I remember correctly, you started with them as an hourly employee?
Yes, I started working in the warehouse. Truett Cathy hired me, the founder, which makes no sense to people until you put it in context. This was, again, almost 45 years ago, and Chick-fil-A was not that big a deal. I learned during the interview process, which, by the way, was one interview with Truett, and he asked me 2 questions. But during the interview process, I learned that I was attempting to become the 16th employee. And so, which that makes sense why Truett would do the interviewing, right? If you've got only 15 employees, the head man or the head woman is probably the one doing the interviews.
Wow. Do you remember what the 2 questions were?
Oh, I do. He said, why do you want a job? I told him I wanted a job working in the warehouse because I knew they had a warehouse. And I was, a young kid at the time. And he said, why do you want to work in our warehouse? And I said, because I really don't have any skills. And I thought it would be inappropriate to ask for a job in marketing or human resources. So he kind of looked at me kind of like, oh, well, that's an interesting answer. Then the second question was, who have you been talking to? And I remember thinking as a kid, that was a really hard question. So I said, who have I been talking to about what, sir? And he said, who have you been talking to about working in our warehouse? And I said, no one. And he said, well, somebody quit yesterday. I guess you can have the job.
Wow.
So I tell people it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job in the warehouse 45 years ago.
Wow. So you've just released your new book, Culture Rules. I think it's your 11th book. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And I believe we first met while you were working on your first book, The Secret, which would have been back in 2008, 2007?
Earlier than that. We met over 20 years ago. Isn't that crazy? Yeah.
I'm getting older than I thought.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Happens to the best of us. As an author, how is it different writing your 11th book than your first book or your 5th book? And what's that experience like?
Well, it's been fantastic. And I know you've done 30 plus, so I think you'll connect with this. Every book for me is a new adventure because it's typically a new topic area. Now, I tend to stay in the lane of leadership, but as you well know, it's a huge topic. It's a huge field. And so if we're going to talk about engagement or high performance organizations or culture, it's for me, it's like, okay, what's universally true about this subject? And I usually surround myself with a lot of really smart people on a research team, and we'll spend months and months and months and sometimes years trying to figure out what those truths are. And then we translate them and try to make them approachable and applicable. So everyone is a new adventure. And I would say a couple of years back, that went to a whole new level. You may know, and I don't know that your audience would know, my first 9 books were parables, business fables. And that's just a different genre. And these last 2 books, I have a new publisher, and he wanted me to write a more traditional book. In fact, now 2 of them. And so it went from a 20,000 word business fable to a 60,000 word leadership book with endnotes and references and data and research and an index. And it's just, so a whole new genre, which was great. I mean, for me, it was like I had to learn something new and different beyond the subject matter. I had to learn how to communicate in a new format and a new style. So I feel like I'm still on that learning curve, which is great.
But still great stories, great case studies, really draws people in. What about, before we get into, we're going to talk about culture, we're going to talk about leadership, we're going to talk organizations, but before we get into that, for the person who's listening, who thinks, well, I'm not a leader, speak to that person for 30 seconds so that we can calibrate them for the conversation.
Okay, I would say that leadership is a function, not a position. And it's a choice. And I don't think poorly of people that don't choose leadership. I think about my wife as an example, a brilliant, caring human being, and she runs if she thinks there's any leadership involved. She will serve a leader. She does not want to be a leader. That's her choice. And I want to honor that. And I want to honor that in anyone that doesn't want to lead, but you can, because it's attitude, it's a skill set, it's a mindset, it's behaviors and competencies that anyone can learn if they choose. And if they choose not to, then I would just encourage them to be a great follower.
Fantastic. And there's great awareness, emotional awareness in knowing, okay, maybe I'm not the leader, but I'm really good at supporting the leader. I'm really good at being number 2 or number 3. So that's fantastic. Your role at the moment, I love your title, High Performance, VP of High Performance Leadership at Chick-fil-A. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like. What do you do day to day? What do you love about that? What are the challenges of that?
Okay, I heard 3 or 4 really good questions there. So the organization chose that title for me, and I serve at the pleasure of the organization. So that is, in fact, my title. It emerged from a season at Chick-fil-A about 25 years ago, when we had opportunities to seize and problems to solve. And I'm going to bet that your listeners, when they encounter a problem to solve or an opportunity to seize, their natural reaction is to put a leader on it. Now, he or she may not actually solve it or do the work themselves, but they'll rally the team and they'll create the resources and they'll create the boundaries and parameters and see that that problem is solved or that opportunity is seized. Well, about 25 years ago, we had problems to solve and opportunities to seize, and we looked over our shoulder at our leadership bench, and it was not impressive. In fact, there were some real holes, right? I call them cracks, actually, because the process we had used for leadership development up until that point was really more of immersion and osmosis. And at a certain scope and scale, you can actually get by with that, but you can't outgrow your leadership capacity. And that's what we were bumping our head against. And so what you do in the short term is you give those problems and opportunities to an existing leader. Again, that's a brilliant short-term play. That is a tragic long-term play, because you're going to wear those people out. You're going to burn them out. It's not sustainable. And I've never seen an organization outgrow its leadership capacity. So in the face of that, our executive committee asked me to solve that problem. And so I did what I've been doing throughout my career. I surround myself with really smart people, and I say, guess what we get to do? And we were actually on a mission to accelerate leadership development strategically, purposefully, within our organization. And that started my work specifically on leadership, even though even to this day, I have additional responsibilities. This is not my full-time work, but it has taken more and more of my mental capacity and my time over the years, because we're still trying to grow leadership capacity. And I think we will forever. I think it was our buddy, John Maxwell, that said, everything rises and falls on leadership. And we want to keep growing. We want to keep adding value to the world. We've got to have more leaders.
Yeah.
And so that has become a bigger and bigger part of my role over the last couple of decades.
Fantastic. How does your role at Chick-fil-A work together with your role as an author?
Well, in the early days, I was writing on nights and weekends, and they came to me and said, hey, this is really good. And I said, I'm so thankful you guys think so. And they said, we want to book a year. And I said, well, there's one fundamental problem. It takes me 3 to 5 years to do one of these. And they said, well, you better get started. And I said, I don't know how many nights and weekends I have. And so what they decided almost 10 years ago was to carve out some of my day job is actually working on writing. So the short answer to your question is it works brilliantly, because the organization is not only encouraging and resourcing these projects, but they're actually allocating some of my time to do the work. So it's been fantastic.
Excellent. You mentioned earlier that sort of the shift, the first 9 books being parable based, and then the last 2 being, more traditionally nonfiction. And one thing that stood out about this one for me was 2 numbers. One was 5,000 and the other was 10 countries, or 5,000 people in 10 countries. Tell us a little bit about the origins of this book and what these numbers mean.
Okay, so one of the things I've always tried to do is to fight my own bias. The bias I'm aware of, but I want to fight the bias I'm unaware of, right? The blind spots. And so one of the disciplines that we've tried to instill over the years, even when I was writing the fable and business fable format, is the team always starts with a look at what do we believe to be universally true about this topic, across time, across space, across roles, across industries, across countries, because I want to be a purveyor of truth. And so in this particular topic on culture, we said, let's do a global study. And we ended up, by the way, by the time we finished, we had over 6,000 people in our sample. That was both the quant research and the interviews, and the focus groups and this, that, and the other. And so we talked to leaders and frontline individual contributors from 10 countries, over 6,000 folks, to figure out what is universally true about organizational culture. So that was the bedrock of our work.
And what surprised you?
How consistent things were across the globe. It was uncanny. I think statistically, the numbers were almost identical around the world, which was crazy. I mean, there are some variation here to there. We asked a lot of questions, and but as a group, the consistency, which excited us, since we're going to write a book about culture that we hope will serve the world, that you can't say, oh, it's only true in the US, or it's only true in Asia, or it's only true in Africa, wherever. So we were all over the world. So that was one thing, a pleasant surprise, the consistency. 2 more, because there was a lot. It surprised me, and this is not the first time we've discovered this, that senior leaders don't see the world the way their frontline people do. Now, some facets and aspects of that are probably okay, because senior leaders have a different role, right? And you would think, however, when you ask them simple questions like, is your organization a great place to work? They answer that 40 points higher than their frontline people.
Wow.
All over the world.
Wow.
And we have found that in other studies. And so at some point, I need to write about how to help leaders stay in touch with the realities of their people. But that number was, I was shocked, surprised, and discouraged that the gap is so wide. But the final one I'll mention is that when we ask leaders about the importance of culture, about 70%, I think it was 60 some odd percent in the rest of the world and 72% in America. So about 70% of the leaders in the world said that culture is the most powerful tool at their disposal to drive performance. Now, that may or may not surprise you, but here's the surprising part. We asked those same leaders to rank their personal priorities at work, and creating and maintaining culture came in at number 12.
Wow.
So it's really the classic knowing doing gap. It's like, I know this is important. In fact, it's number one. It's the number one driver of performance. And there are 11 things ahead of it on how I spend my time. So that actually became our charge. How can we make this topic approachable, accessible, actionable? Because we realize one of the reasons they don't work on it is a lot of leaders don't know how to work on culture. And so that was actually the turning point in our work, was when we said, we've got to try to close this gap, or not lower the importance level, because it should be higher than 72%, but to help people move it up their priority list. And we think that if we make it actionable and approachable, accessible, that hopefully we can do that.
That's fascinating. So other than not knowing how to do it, you go through this process with these leaders, and some of it's done on surveys, some of it's done in interviews or small groups. If you confront them with, these two facts, you said that culture was the most powerful tool available to you, but it's number 12 on your, priority list. When you confront them with these two facts, what other sorts of things do they say?
Well, they talk about busyness. They talk about complexity. They talk about competing priorities. They talk about resource constraints, which, interesting, this is not intended to be a plug for my last book, but we wrote a book called Smart Leadership, which is built on the premise of helping leaders get out of the quicksand. And what we heard is we knew, because of the previous project, that so many leaders are in quicksand. Working on culture feels like swimming lessons. They're drowning. How do you get somebody excited about swimming lessons if they're drowning?
Yeah.
So we heard a lot of that. Then there's some fear. There's a little bit of fear. There's a little bit of lack of clarity, which we get to later in this conversation. It's like, well, I don't know what kind of culture I want, so I can't declare it. I can't pursue it. So we heard a lot of things. It was fascinating.
You learned 3 things you believe every leader can do to build a vibrant culture, and in the book you call them rules.
How does that set? How does that set with you calling them rules? Because we've gotten pushback on that.
It didn't strike me. I didn't think anything about it at first read. In a conversation with some of my people, they raised, or how that going to go down with certain people. I think we live in a culture where people are increasingly entitled and increasingly reject accountability, and so anything that looks like a rule is it can be threatening in that environment. So, but it didn't strike me as anything other than really good guidance. I think champions love coaching, and I think there's really good wisdom here. But Let's take a
Well,
look.
let me say this. No. I want to say real quick. I want to say, because I appreciate that. I want to say the rules thing has actually been a stumbling block for some folks. You sounds like you worked past it pretty quick. And I said, look, imagine your favorite sport with no rules. It would be chaos. And again, in an American audience, I know your origin story, but in an American audience, I'd say, think of football with no rules. And they say, oh, well, that's rugby. Well, no, I'm not even talking about rugby. I'm talking about no rules. It would be chaos. There is no game without rules. And I said, the second thing rules do for you is they tell you how to win. You play by the rules and you can win, because if you violate the rules in many games, and I think this is the game of building culture, you violate the rules, you're disqualified. And if you violate these 3 rules as a leader, you are disqualified. You have chosen to sub-optimize your influence, your leadership, and your performance. So if those rules exist, and we believe they do, I want to know them. I want to play well, I want to win, and I do not want to be disqualified.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight. I mean, the other thing that I found interesting in the conversation was that people weren't saying, oh, I disagree with that rule, or I think that rule is wrong. That we're arguing about the semantics of it. And what I said to them was, okay, well, you can disagree with gravity, but if you walk off a roof, gravity is still going to do what gravity does, and pretending it doesn't exist, or not liking the way it's presented as a law, because that's not even a rule, that's a law. Oh, I don't like laws. Well, okay, well, if you walk off the roof, gravity is still going to be a law, and it is still going to do what it does.
So here's what I would say, last thought, and we can move on. For anybody that gets hung up there, call them suggestions for success.
Love it. Love it.
All right, there are 3 rules.
Tell us about the first one.
The first rule is to aspire. Share your hopes and dreams for your culture. Now, that probably sounds like a blinding flash of the obvious. I mean, I know you wrote a book on culture, which, by the way, I loved. And for your audience, that's what we asked you to come talk to 8,000 chicken people about your book. We loved your book. And so you may have encountered this as you were doing your writing and research and consulting. We met so many leaders that could not clearly, simply, in a repeatable form and fashion, share their hopes and dreams for their culture. And I would argue that you cannot, with any level of predictability, you cannot create what you cannot articulate. And even if you're doing it intuitively, then you don't have other people around you to help you. And to create a culture, you need other people around you. So I tell people, it's not the most important of the 3 rules, but it's first among equals. Like, you're dead in the water if you can't share your hopes and dreams for your culture. It's a rule. It's a law. You got to do that.
Yeah. What's an example of a leader that you've seen who's done it well, or how do they articulate it?
Well, okay, that's one of the stumbling blocks that we discovered. When you say, how do they articulate it? There is and again, I know you've encountered this. There is so much out there on language. There's content, and I know you've written some of this. There's content on purpose and mission and vision and values and ethos. And you have really, really smart people, I know you've encountered this, who fundamentally disagree. Some people use the definition for vision and put it on mission, and some people use the definition of mission and put it on vision, blah, 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 blah. That paralyzes a lot of leaders. And they say, well, do I need all of those? And it's like, listen, all of those are mechanisms to help you do one thing, to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. So you choose. You may have a personal preference or a bias or a mission or a purpose or values. It's like, choose that. And you may want a couple of those, because you can, as you know, parse out the language, and they actually technically mean different things. Yes. But that overwhelms a lot of people, and it confuses a lot of people, because I said at the end of the day, it has to be clear, it has to be simple, and it has to be repeatable. So the folks that have chosen a mission, a vision, values, ethos, and 12 core values, I think they fail the simple, clear, and repeatable test, right? Because you want them to be actionable. You want them to inform behavior. And so I think the biggest challenge I see out there is this confusion / paralysis around language. And here's the last piece of that. Sometimes it's clear in the leader's head and heart. When I say mission, I know what that means. But the people are reading some other thought leader who defines it differently, and then they have a disconnect. So I tell leaders, whatever language you choose, you have to define it for your people and say, here's what I mean by mission. Here's what our mission is, and here's what I mean by mission. So we just see a lot of people get tangled up in that.
Interesting. Why do you think it is so hard for leaders to abide by this simplicity that you're promoting?
Well, the world wars against simplicity. I think it always has. I think the world is becoming more and more complex. I think that's the world we live in. And yeah, I hope we can chip away at that. And we did this. We just took the content we're talking about right now. We just shared it with almost 9,000 chicken people. The same event you spoke at. We've grown a little bit since you were with us. And we spent 3 days unpacking this. We took 1 day for each rule with those 9,000 people. And this first rule, we translated it to a question. We said, the question is, what are your hopes and dreams for your culture? And so we're trying, again, for those that want it to be more complicated, they can make it as complicated as they want. But at the end of the day, that is the question you're trying to answer, and to help your organization understand your answer.
So I'm thinking about this, my wife Maggie and I, now we have 5 children under the age of 13, and yeah, I see a lot of parents who are unable to articulate that for their family. I see a lot of coaches, they get the kids together at the beginning of the season. There's baseball, football, soccer, basketball, whatever it is, and they struggle to give sort of, okay, they'll give some, do this, don't do this, don't do that, do this, but they won't give this vision of, okay, this is what we're trying to do here. And so I see it as universally applicable across cultures, whether it's the culture of a business or the culture of a family, culture of marriage, culture of a school, a church, a sports team. Talk to us about the second rule.
The second rule is to amplify. Amplify. You have to work to constantly reinforce the aspiration, because we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's the right word, probably months. I hate to admit that, but we wanted the best possible word. And we actually think amplify is appropriate in part because of the noise in the world. That quicksand I talked about, right? I'm mixing metaphors here, but the leaders have to get the aspiration to a level, maybe not literally, but figuratively, that it transcends the noise. They have to make people believe that it's true and that it's something we're actually going to pursue, not a flavor of the month, not a passing fad. No, this is legit. This is going to stick. We're going to work on this. And you do that by turning up the volume.
Okay, so you raised something else that that leads me to a question. So sometimes a leader will say, okay, we're going to get serious about culture, and they'll come to their next level of leadership, and the next level of leadership will say, that's great, but it's going to be seen as the flavor of the month or this month's message, and they'll even push back a little bit because of that. What advice would you have to a leader who needs to overcome the skepticism or the cynicism that this thing isn't going to last?
Well, I think first they have to make that decision in their own head and their own heart. Like, no, this is not going away. these are my hopes and dreams for this culture. And I hope and believe that you share these hopes and dreams. So let's get to work and make them a reality. And then you have to fight the shiny object syndrome, right? And I'm not saying there won't be other new things in the culture, but this is where constancy really matters. One of the strategies that we talk about in the book, in fact, we devoted an entire chapter to it, because I will say this: after you have the rule, there are any number of ways to activate. You have to activate it. And the number one thing that we found, and that I believe from experience, is that people always watch the leader. People always watch the leader. So the number one way to amplify the aspiration is the behavior of the leader. And so you've actually got to live like what you're saying is true. You've got to walk the talk. And when leaders do that, people pay attention. And when leaders don't do that, you lose trust, you lose credibility, you lose followership. It's just tragic. I tell leaders, if you're not willing to walk the talk, keep your mouth shut. Because they don't tell them something you're not going to do. You'll torpedo your own leadership.
That's very interesting. So, we talk about rule number one, we talk about rule number two. When I was reading the book, I'm sort of like, okay, it sort of feels complete now already. You obviously disagree with that, because there's a rule number three. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, I think there is a trap there, and it's multifaceted. You and I, as leaders, love to get stuff done. We love to check stuff off. We love progress. And here's what happens. If you have a clear aspiration and you amplify it well, the culture will begin to move toward that aspiration. It'll happen. It's extremely predictable, because people always watch the leader. If that's all you do is say it's important and act like it's important, people are going to move towards that. That's the risk. Because, see, culture is a living, breathing, dynamic organism, right? And if you try to bubble wrap it, you try to protect it, you'll suffocate it. You'll kill it. You'll kill it. So the third rule is to adapt, to always be working to enhance the culture. Now, let me quick word on this. I don't know if we want to chase this, but even I had somebody recently say, okay, enhance, like, what do you mean by that? I said, okay, any number of categories. One way you can enhance a culture is to attack and eliminate a toxin. If you have patterns of unhealthy, unproductive behavior as a leader, you have got to get that out, because toxins will metastasize, right? They will ultimately kill an organization. And we've got some case studies in the book. But one way to enhance is to go after toxins. Another way to enhance is, let's pretend that a lot of your listeners have a healthy and thriving and vibrant culture. It's like, are we off the hook? Well, no, you're always looking for ways to enhance the culture. So one thing you can do is double down on a strength. Because if you're really good at something and you get better, you just strengthened your culture. And then the third is to add new capabilities. And this is one that some leaders miss. And I think it's just because it's not talked about enough. We had an example of that a few years back. The president of our company said, we need to be more innovative. Now, we've had innovators throughout our history. Truett Cathy was the original innovator, right? He invented the chicken sandwich. But what we had were individuals and pockets of innovation. So our senior leader, our president, said, I think we need to become more innovative as an organization and set that aspiration. We began to amplify it. And I would argue we're more innovative today as an organization than we were a decade ago. So that was the adaptation around what new capabilities could we add to strengthen the enterprise, to strengthen the culture of the entire organization. So eliminate toxins, leverage strengths, or add new capabilities. That's what keeps a culture vibrant.
It's fantastic. So, one of the things I've heard you say over and over, really, for probably at least a decade now, is the idea that your capacity to learn determines your capacity for leadership. I don't know if I'm getting the quote exactly right, but
That's close enough.
Talk to us a little bit about the importance of learning, why people do it, why people neglect it, those sorts of things.
Well, let me say, I don't know if I'm qualified to say why people don't, but let me tell you why I do. Over 40 years ago, like I was a young pup over 40 years ago. And I had a leader that explained that to me. And here's the way he positioned it. He said, if you want more influence, if you want more opportunity, if you want more impact, he said, there's only one path. It's lifelong learning. He said, that's it. And out of that conversation came the phrase, your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. And so I made a choice as a young person. I guess I might technically have been leading one or two people at the time, but I probably wasn't qualified to be a leader at the time. But I made the choice. I said, oh, is that how the world works? Didn't know that. And I made a choice to embrace lifelong learning. Now, someone challenged me on that one day. They said, well, that's probably easy for you. And I said, well, tell me why you would say that. And they said, well, I'm assuming that learner is one of your strengths. Some of your audience will be familiar with strengths finders and this, that, and the other. And I said, well, that's interesting because I don't think learner is in my top 25.
Wow.
And they said, that's odd. I said, why is it odd? They said, well, you act like a learner. And I said, well, I made a choice because I want more opportunity. I want more influence. I want more impact. And I was convinced at a young age, if that's the path, that's what I'm going to do. My parents wish I'd have made that decision much earlier because I was an awful student. But now I've committed to lifelong learning. So I'd much rather listen to the radio in the car than a podcast or a book. Most days I'm going to listen to a podcast or a book. Well, why would you do that? Because I made a choice, a strategic decision, because when I learn, it better positions me to add value to others. And so that's why I do it. I don't know why people would choose not to. I mean, that's their choice. But I think if they make that choice, they've chosen to limit their influence, their impact, and their opportunity. Last thought on that. We talked about this in the last book. People have asked me on and off for years if there is a leadership fountain of youth. I don't know if you've ever gotten that question. And what I used to say is, I hope so, because I want to add value to my last breath. Now I say absolutely, and it's curiosity. That's how leaders can maintain relevance for today and vitality for tomorrow, is if they'll keep learning, And so I think it's the best game in town that too many people have missed.
Interesting. Now, as you're obviously, we live in a world of infinite opportunities now for learning. You know, we've got obviously books, and we've got audio books, we've got podcasts, with conferences and webinars and these sorts of things. What is your preferred method of, continuous learning?
Well, it's actually a combination of those things, but let me add one to your list, something that I didn't do necessarily strategically, but it's been huge for me, is I started a group of men 25 years ago to study leadership. And we've been meeting twice a month for 25 years.
Wow.
And there are 10 of us. And I think 6 of the group were in the original group from 25 years ago. And so we study leadership, life on life, talk about our situation, talk about our circumstances. We consume content virtually every time we meet. And for me, that's been a piece of the puzzle, and all the other things you mentioned.
Fantastic. It's been a great conversation. Sometimes when I have these conversations and I'm on the other end, I feel like, oh, I've got something I'd rather say or I'd love to say to the audience. Let me turn it over to you here for a minute and share whatever it is you feel, on your heart and on your mind you'd like to share with the audience as we wrap this up.
All right. And then I'm going to let you do the same thing.
All right.
Every organization has a culture. It's either by design or default. Leaders leaders are the architects. Leaders are the designers. Leaders animate culture. And we need to involve others, but we can't delegate this responsibility away. When you delegate it away, you've actually abdicated leadership, and then you'll get what you get, right?
Yes.
So I think that's my first word of encouragement. And then secondly, there's a story. Some of your audience may have either seen the movie or read the book, Ready Player One. Ernest Cline wrote it, and Steven Spielberg made the movie. Here, a quick synopsis. There's a kid in the movie, Wade Watson, who lives in two worlds. He lives in the real world and he lives in an online world. In the movie, it's called the Oasis. And he's trying to meet the challenges of the virtual world in hopes that he can have an impact on the real world. It's a fascinating story. But the reason I set that up is there's one line in that book that I think applies so directly to the opportunity that we have as leaders. He says this. He says, people go to the Oasis for what they can do there, and they stay because of who they can become. And I'm sitting here going, wouldn't it be so amazing? Just imagine as a leader, if you could create a culture, oh, and by the way, you can, that is so attractive, it draws people for what they can do. They can get a job, but they want it at your place because of the culture. And then after they get there, they realize who they can become. And then they stay. I want to encourage leaders to raise your sight. Culture is the most powerful tool you have, not only to drive performance, but a healthy, vibrant, thriving, high-performance culture is soul enriching and life-giving. You can provide that for your people. They may come for what they can do, but they'll stay for who they can become.
That's a fantastic story. Fantastic story. My guest is Mark Miller, the book Culture Rules. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Book's available on audiobook. It's available on as a physical book. It's a beautiful book. It's available as an ebook. Get yourself a copy. Mark, good to be with you. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we can have another conversation again before too long.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.